It was the turn of the century, December 1999. NASA just launched the Terra platform. This new shiny thing called the DVD was slowly putting those big movie bricks out of business. Pokemon Gold and Silver just released in Japan. Phones still looked like TV remotes. And everyone was convinced that Y2K would bring the destruction of mankind as we know it. As for film, many consider 1999 to be a pivotal year in film history. There was a lot of changes going on. Changes that would eventually sculpt the next decade of film. I want to look at the film industry from January 1st, 2000 to December 31st, 2009, and see what movies got it from point A to point B. We're going to examine some of the technological and cultural developments that made the success of certain films possible. As a disclaimer, I'm trying to make this list as objectively as possible. This isn't a best of the decade list, not at all, nor is it any indication of my personal favorite films of this decade. This also doesn't mean this is a popularity contest. Regardless of how well a film performs, this doesn't mean it will have an impact on the film industry. With that being said, some films on this list happen to be both popular and influential. With the films discussed, I want to take a look at the movies that undeniably left a mark on either the film industry or even the world at large. In the wise words of Cole Kushner, let's dissect. What I find remarkable about this year is that there was hardly any sequels or reboots. I guess filmmakers must have been inspired by the millennium to create something new. The only notable sequel was Scream 3. While it would have been nice for reboots and sequels to say something in the past, it's gonna change very quickly. But the movie I want to talk about in this section was influential in starting a trend that would continue on throughout the 2000s. I want to reiterate, a film's placement in this video doesn't necessarily indicate its cinematic value, but more so its significance in film history. I say this again because I fear many of you are going to think I'm trolling with this pick or being a bit silly or facetious, especially because it's the first one on this list. It's just unlucky that it happened to be the first one. But I promise there's more traditional movies and stuff you might be expecting later on. But with that being said, okay. Scary Movie. In a way, this movie is both more clever than people give it credit for, but also just as dumb as its biggest haters will have you believe it is. The film was written by the Wayans brothers, who went on to have a bit of a run in the early 2000s with their comedy movies. With films like White Chicks and that weird fucking Little Man movie, these two were super popular in the early 2000s, and it all came from the success of Scary Movie. Here's something interesting about the script for Scary Movie. The movie was written solely by the Wayans brothers and Buddy Johnson. But if you pay attention, there's also two gentlemen who didn't add a single word to the script that were also credited as writers. Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer. Why did they get writers credits? Well, at the time Scary Movie was being produced, these two fucking dimwits were also working on a movie that parodied Scream. At some point, Miramax stepped in and decided to say, hey, why is there two Scary Movie parodies being made? And then after, they brought up an interesting question, Miramax then said, okay, fuck it, we're gonna just credit all of you for writing Scary Movie. I mentioned this piece of trivia because of the work these two would do after the film, which I'll get into in a second, but okay, let's finally talk about Scary Movie. It's a parody movie that makes fun of the horror genre as a whole. The plot of the movie is a comedic mishmash of Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer. It's just as complex, or I guess uncomplex, as the films it pokes fun at. A group of teens are chased by an unknown killer as they're picked off one by one. Pretty straightforward stuff. In some instances of the film, the level of parody captures every little camera movement and piece of set design from the movie screen. Aside from its obvious pieces of inspiration, the film also borrows from films like Halloween, The Matrix, and even American Pie. On the surface, Scary Movie can be seen as just a dumb parody movie. I get it. But I disagree for two reasons. One, it single-handedly started the parody movie trend of the 2000s. Disaster movie, epic movie, date movie, superhero movie, so on and so forth, are all the offspring of the impact this film had, all of which were made by these two buffoons. See why I mentioned that trivia? So all of these movies that came out after the fact were essentially like a Where's Waldo of movie references. Like, hey, do you recognize this? Kind of like the movie Pixels that came out with Adam Sandler. And on the contrary, Scary Movie sticks to parodying exclusively horror films for the most part, and rarely strays from it. Which leads me to point two, is that Scary Movie, as I said, is pretty clever. It's pretty clever. The film parodies the movie Scream, which in itself is a parody of scary movies. The film Scream by Wes Craven was made as a critique of how derivative and soulless the genre had become. Ever since the success of Halloween in 1978, shameless producers did anything to cash in on the slasher genre craze. In fact, that's the only reason Friday the 13th exists. It was a cash grab. The director or producer, like someone themselves even admit it. I'll put it on the screen. So then Wes Craven and the movie Scream made fun of this by presenting yet another killer in a mask killing a bunch of teenagers, but with a self-aware edge.
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number one, you can never have sex.
Ironically, Scream succeeded, and as of 2023, it's on its 6th movie, ultimately becoming what it set out to destroy, and it is now a parody of itself. So to come full circle, Scary Movie is a parody of a parody. I mean, the film doesn't even bother to change the mask of the killer. It's literally the one from Scream. So, going into this film with the context of the film industry in mind, with specifically the horror genre in mind, I think the film becomes funnier and more interesting.
Scream was what you call an unfunny spoof. See, Scream was like, it just said some things. We're doing the things that Scream thought about doing, but didn't do. Scream was cool. Then Scream 2 started to get a little annoying. And then I Know What You Did Last Summer made us go, you know what? It's time to parody you.
The film is ultimately significant as I see it as the inflection point, the climax of parody films. The films that would follow this one were ultimately just a lot of nonsense filled with random goofy references. But Scary Movie marks a point where the humor was so ironic and so meta that quite frankly, I still think it goes over most audience members' heads.
Right? At least you want some motive. Did Scream have a plot?
No.
Did I Know You Did Last Summer make any sense?
Don't think so.
And what about the sequel? Huh? What the hell's with that fat white Jamaican
Oh,
kid?
I want to kill that mother, man.
It's bad casting, Bobby.
By the time 2001 came around, 3D animation was still a relatively new style. Prior to the technological developments pioneered by Pixar, 2D animation and stop motion was the only form of animated media you could get. Disney was putting out consistent 2D animated movies for decades at this point, but the industry was undergoing a series of technological developments that would push 3D animation into the forefront of movie theaters. The film that broke through and eventually solidified 3D animation's place was Toy Story. Toy Story was the first fully 3D, completely computer-generated film. The movie was the second highest earning of that year, right behind Die Hard with a Vengeance. Not only was it the first 3D animated movie, but the film also had a lot going for it. Toy Story managed to bring in a wide range of audience members, being accessible to children, but to parents also. This would also be their calling card for the entirety of their filmography. Pixar would ultimately be the first studio to push through with 3D animation, but it was not the only. A year before Toy Story was released, a company called DreamWorks was founded and followed Pixar's footsteps in producing 3D animated movies that anyone could watch. Pixar and DreamWorks produced a series of animated movies in this time that would go on to become regarded as classics. the genre eventually managed to accrue widespread recognition and praise. In 2001, the category for the Best Animated Film was finally added to the Academy Awards, which brings us to
Shrek's gon' give it to you. Fuck, wait for you to get it on your own. Shrek's gon' deliver to you. Knock, knock, open up.
What can I say about Shrek? It is love, it is life. Shrek was the 6th animated feature by DreamWorks, and this thing is just awesome. What you may not know is that Shrek was originally intended to be a mishmash of live-action CG animation, with background plate miniature sets and the main characters composited into the scene as motion-captured computer graphics. After that just did not work, DreamWorks went on to do it in 3D animation. Shrek is a movie that pokes fun at the animated Disney movies that were popular for the last 20 years. I feel this is where I would usually go into details about the plot, but it's Shrek. If you haven't seen Shrek, it's hard to say you've truly lived or done anything meaningful. It's Shrek. This film has such a spot in pop culture that in 2020 it was added to the National Film Registry. The National Film Registry is a list of movies deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant that are earmarked for preservation by the Library of Congress. They are not selected as the best American films of all time, but rather as works of enduring importance to American culture. The films that are added to this list can sometimes be added as late as 60 years after the release of the film. These films are added long after the release of the film as a means of how culturally relevant it has remained. In case you're curious, here's a few other movies that have been added to the list, some of which may surprise you. But okay, back to Shrek. Shrek was definitely an unlikely success, but there was a lot of things it had going for it. The casting of Mike Myers, Eddie Murphy, and Cameron Diaz as the main characters was great. The film also looks great too. It's aged beautifully. At the time, Shrek's animation was pretty ambitious. The Shrek visual effects supervisor mentioned that the animation was, quote, a level of complexity in the movie that hasn't been done before, unquote. While it isn't mentioned outright, I get the impression the animators recognized the limitations of the time. Instead of going with an over-detailed style that would have aged like milk, they fully embraced the cartoony fantasy look. It's simple and it really gets the job done. It's immersive throughout. It was around this time that animation was beginning to be taken more seriously in the film industry. As mentioned earlier, 2001 was the first year the Academy Awards would include the category for Best Animated Feature. The nominees in the animation category for 2001 were Shrek, Jimmy Neutron, and Monsters Inc. Shrek marked a point in film history where technology and animation were converging to create the more engaging and vivid experiences for audiences. Animation as a genre can still sometimes be discredited to this day, but hey, all it takes is a freaking panic attack, I guess, to be taken seriously. And seriously, that's what it was. That's so freaking silly. I mean, there's all these classic films, but Puss in Boots had a panic attack. Spider-Man. What can be said about this movie that hasn't been said already? I mean, it's awesome, it's classic, it's Tobey Maguire, it's Sam Raimi, it is Kristen Dunst, it is Willem the frickin' Foe. I'll admit to being biased, as this was a Spider-Man I grew up with, but I think this is by far the best trilogy, and it all started with the first one. As it stands, the first Spider-Man is classic. It's a great movie that is just fun to watch. The fight scenes are fun and creative. The balance between Peter Parker and Spider-Man is perfect. That's something the later films could never do as well. They don't seem to capture the tension Peter Parker has with his double life quite as well as in the original trilogy, in my opinion. I feel the later movies almost try to get the Peter Parker stuff done as quickly as possible, like you did your homework and now you can play. It feels like an afterthought. But the original film gives his student and romantic life much more time of day. So much so that when you break it down to its core, the film can also be considered more of a romantic coming-of-age story first, and a superhero movie second.
I thought this was a very good movie. I think sometimes in these movies, there's too much action, and they don't care at all about the two people But you guys, you and Toby have this great chemistry, and they really took some time to like develop that story. It was nice.
No,
This balance proved to be effective as it was the most popular film of 2002, raking in over $400 million. Aside from that, this film is significant because it got studios' heads to move towards superhero movies. It wasn't immediate, but seeds were planted. Seeds that would eventually grow into money-eating Venus flytraps. The early 2000s was an interesting time for superhero movies. The genre was doing okay, but of course, we all know what it would become down the line. So when Spider-Man came out in 2002, it was really a novelty. The last time a superhero movie was doing big numbers was the Batman films of the 1990s. They're not good, none of them, they're all bad.
I have a riddle for you.
For me.
Really?
Blade and X-Men were also out, but those were a bit more adult in tone. So Spider-Man was able to bring in wide numbers because it was accessible to pretty much anyone. Have you ever met anyone who says they don't like Spider-Man? They're freaks or they're lying. Lastly, the film was directed by Sam Raimi, and his vision for the film was just awesome. The film utilizes a ton of camera movements that really capture the energy of Spider-Man. So with all these variables at play, the film was pretty much designed to be a win. Beyond that, 2002 was an interesting year in cinema. Comedies were still doing really well. My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Men in Black 2, Ice Age, and Austin Powers, and The Goldmember were all in the top 10 highest grossing films. From today's point of view, that's just remarkable. I mean, seriously, My Big Fat Greek Wedding was the 5th most popular film of that year. Why? I mean, that's just absurd. 2002 was also a big year for sequels. You had Star Wars Attack of the Clones, Lord of the Rings The Two Towers, and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. All 3 of these dominated the charts and set a foundation for things to come years later. All in all, this year was pretty much dominated by a sense of fantasy. Audiences were into escapist movies, which makes sense given the events of the previous year. Audiences just wanted a break from it all, a place filled with magic, and space magic. Okay, so after doing as much research as I could in these 2 years, I gotta be honest, I found nothing. They're as dry as the Sahara Desert. Not that there wasn't good films released these 2 years, there was a lot of great films, but ultimately, none of them represented any kind of change or direction for the industry. Things move slowly sometimes. It's not always the case that you get a movie that pushes things ahead. Instead of looking at one movie for each year as we've done so far and continue to do so for the rest of the video, we'll examine some interesting trends in the film industry that were going on and a few notable films that came out. The first thing that comes to mind is just how incredible animation was doing. The early 2000s was a serious renaissance for classic animated movies. Finding Nemo, the SpongeBob movie, The Incredibles, Shrek frickin' 2. I recently rewatched the film with some friends and my god is it good. I mean, it's certified gold. Also, the Animatrix came out too, and it's just dripping with style and creativity. I mean, what a couple of years of animation, seriously. With the new technology, artists were now able to create more detailed and cinematic stories. Ambitious filmmakers made some of the finest movies the genre has to offer. Aside from that, sequels were also in full swing. You had Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Lord of the Rings Return of the King, The Matrix Reloaded, Terminator 3, and Spider-Man 2. I see these 2 years as kind of a downtime in the film industry. Things were still progressing, no doubt, but sometimes things just chill out for a few years and as people adapt to the new tools at their disposal. I think that's why all of these films were so popular. Audiences were passively aware of these new technologies and were comfortable seeing stuff that was familiar, but with new flashy visuals.
Hey, baby! You came back just in time.
There was no demand for a crazy new original film, because that wasn't where the industry was at. Like I said, it was some downtime. People were more than happy seeing Spider-Man and Harry Potter again, because they were now prettier and more fleshed out. Roger Ebert, who was kind of like the Fantano of Movie Reviews, commented on Spider-Man 2 by saying, quote, "Director Sam Raimi's first Spider-Man movie was thin and the special effects too cartoony, but the sequel is a transformation. And the special effects, while understandably not realistic, bring a presence and sense of literal gravity to the film. Spider-Man now seems like a human being and not a drawing." Unquote. He hit it right on the money. As much as I love the first Spider-Man, some of the CG has aged miserably, whereas Spider-Man 2 still holds up. He also went on to call it the greatest superhero movie ever made, and honestly, I think I agree. The thing's a freaking 10.
Pizza time. I'm not paying for those.
So if there's one thing that can definitely be said about these 2 years, is that both audiences and producers were content creating films that just pushed what they can do. With that being said, I do want to briefly touch on one film that utilized no fancy CG or special effects. I don't think it was influential enough to deserve an entire segment, but if I was going to write about a single film for 2004, it would have been Saw. Saw is a film about a person known as the Jigsaw Killer putting his victims' will to live to the test by making them play in extreme games that would often make them inflict some kind of physical pain to themselves. The film follows a non-linear plot that slowly unravels as you watch. The film, like many horror films, was made with very little money, only around $1 million. And just like those other films, it made millions off of that. The reception of this film is really interesting. People will either call it a classic masterpiece or straight garbage. In fact, as it stands, the film has a 50% score on Rotten Tomatoes. It's as split as it gets. The reason it was considered for being on the list is that many sites saw as the movie that ushered in a new genre of extreme horror, or torture films as they're called. In fact, you often hear this a lot, that Saw had this kind of impact that changed the face of horror. I've done a lot of research for this video, a lot, and before researching this video, I mostly took people's word for it. But after looking into it, it's not really the case. I mean, Saw never had any kind of influence beyond being the first film of that nature to land as big as it did. Saw didn't invent torture horror, not at all. The genre had been alive and well, it just wasn't mainstream. So Saw can be considered significant as it was the first film with that level of intensity to get audiences to go in drones. But that's about it. Although Saw did succeed and prove the genre had some commercial viability, the face of horror, let alone the film industry at large, wasn't shaken up by the release of the movie. Compare this to, say, Halloween, you can clearly see the difference. When Halloween debuted in 1978, it was the first slasher film to become that successful. It wasn't the first slasher movie, but it was the first to become that big. But unlike Saw, its influence is clear as day. The 80s was the pinnacle of slasher horror movies. Do you know how many Friday the 13th were released from 1980 to 1989? I mean, take a guess. Out of the entire decade of the 80s, the only years that didn't get a new Friday the 13th were 83 and 87. I know what you're thinking. They couldn't have been that popular, and nope, they were all extremely popular. The same goes for Nightmare on Elm Street, which had 5 movies throughout the decade, all of which were also popular. So Halloween was undeniably responsible for this trend, and it can be backed by the years that followed it. The same cannot be said for Saw. Also, after writing this, I realize now I wrote way more than I intended to about Saw, but whatever, fuck it. Before we get into which film was most influential during 2005, we're going to take a brief but necessary detour to look at a film that was released in 1982, Making Love. Making Love is a movie released in February 1982 about a character named Zach coming to terms with his attraction to men while being married to a woman. During the 1980s, there was a ton of discrimination towards gay people. In fact, many people referred to AIDS as the gay plague. People like Anita Bryant openly discussed taking rights away from gay people. Not even the owner of 20th Century Fox, the distributor of Making Love, was happy with the movie. In fact, when he was first screened the movie, he said, quote, "You made a goddamn F-slur movie," unquote. He walked out and then chose to not release the movie for an entire year. Once it came out, most critics hated it. The only person who seemingly enjoyed the films were gay people. As it stands now, the film has received much more appreciation and love, but its reception in 1982 was a product of the times. So fast forward to 2005, and as awful as it is, there was still a lot of homophobia in the country. And it was incredibly normal. The culture at this time was generally insensitive to the LGBT community, and there was rarely any mainstream media that depicted any kind of representation for the community. And turn on a rap song from this era and count how many times the F-slur is used.
Everybody in hip-hop discriminates against gay people.
With that being said, things were starting to change. In 2003, the Supreme Court struck down state laws that criminalized gay sex. States, cities, and corporations were now prohibiting discrimination based on sexual preference, and a Gallup poll done in 2005 showed most Americans between the ages of 18 to 35 were supportive of gay marriage. So finally, that long-winded setup brings us to Brokeback Mountain. Out of all the films released this year, maybe even in the entire decade, this might be the most significant. Brokeback Mountain is a neo-western romantic drama about two cowboys, Ennis Del Mar and Jack Twist. They're hired to herd some sheep, and eventually they become intimate with each other. The film explores the complex nature of their relationship as closeted gay men. I don't want to spoil too much of the film if you haven't seen it, but it's a great watch. The performance from Jake Gyllenhaal and Heath Ledger was great, and director Ang Lee killed it. The film does a great job communicating that their love is real, honest, and just as important as anyone else's. The impact of this film was monumental. It was kind of surreal how much widespread praise the film got. Of course, you had a few jerks who hated it, saying stupid things like the film pushed an agenda, but all in all, it was a hit. This thing was a commercial and critical success. Even President Bill Clinton had a screening of the movie at the White House and supported the movie. The film was made on a shoestring budget of $14 million, but brought in $178 million worldwide. Critics were also happy with the film. Roger Ebert gave the film a 4/4, which is like a 10 out of 10 from the needle drop. Beyond that, this film was nominated for 8 Academy Awards and won 3.
And the Oscar goes to Ang Lee for Brokeback Mountain.
Like other films on this list, this film paved the way for films that would come out years later. Films like Moonlight and Call Me By Your Name are like the grandchildren of Brokeback Mountain. The rest of 2005 was nothing to write home about, especially relative to Brokeback Mountain. To be frank, 2005 was more of the same as the past couple years. Star Wars and Harry Potter were still going strong. There was a couple of superhero movies and King frickin' Kong. Who cares? While there's a few really solid movies to come out of this year, like I said, none of them really carry the weight of Brokeback Mountain. So let's talk about 2006. "2006 was so freaking boring, I've been forced to write about an Inconvenient Truth. Good lord, this year had almost nothing. Not nothing, but almost nothing. I mean, you had The Departed, which is a pretty good movie, but definitely not revolutionary or impactful to the industry. Cars released this year as well, and maybe if you had me at gunpoint, I'd watch this movie, but I would not touch this movie with a freaking 100-foot pole. And funnily enough, this movie held the title for highest opening weekend for any car-oriented movie until it was beaten in 2009 by Fast and Furious. That's just a weird title to have. I mean, who's even keeping track of that? Car-oriented movies? What the hell? That's like if I were to make a record for highest opening weekend for talking baseball bat-oriented films.
Want a break from the
Take whatever you want, just don't hurt me.
There was also Babel, which, truth be told, I haven't seen this one, I'm sure I will one day, but it's just not a priority. I mean, when was the last time someone was like, bro, you've got to watch Babel? I can't even really recall anyone even bringing up the movie in general, let alone recommending it. Come to think of it, this might even be the first time I've heard of this movie. Yeah, I'm not watching that. The fuck was I thinking? Sorry. What was I talking about again? Oh yeah, An Inconvenient Truth. Full disclaimer, this film definitely did not push the film industry anywhere, but it did leave a mark on culture. The one who spearheaded the film was Al Gore, the former vice president of the United States. In the early 2000s, he dedicated his time to being an environmental activist who would go across the nation giving presentations on the health of the planet. Al Gore discusses how the greenhouse effect is slowly increasing the temperature of the Earth. The inspiration for the documentary came when producer Lori David attended one of Al Gore's presentations about global warming. She was so moved by what she saw that she decided to make the presentation into a film. The film then premiered at that year's Cannes Film Festival, alongside Babel, Fast Food Nation, and even Daft Punk's Electroma. The film did great. Its run at the festival even receiving 3 standing ovations. Outside of the festival, when the documentary played at normal theaters, it made $50 million. I gotta be honest, for a documentary, that is impressive. As of today, it's the 22nd highest grossing documentary. If you're curious what number 1 is, this is it. So although the film wasn't necessarily indicative of where the film industry was going, it's arguably more important than any of the films on the list because it was definitely indicative of where the world was going. So, I mean, who gives a shit about Cinderella or Nacho Libre when the world is on fire? The film was also super relevant around its release. It started a mass conversation about what we're doing to the planet and what we can do to prevent the planet from becoming uninhabitable. The film got 2 Oscars and even the Nobel Peace Prize. It's worth noting that some people outwardly dismissed the film, sometimes without even watching it. The film was famously mocked on South Park's Man Bear Pig episode, which depicted Al Gore as a bumbling and sensitive moron, poking fun at how serious he wanted to come across. When then President George Bush was asked if he would watch the film, he said, quote, "Doubt it. New technologies will change how we live and how we drive our cars, which all will have the beneficial effect of improving the environment. And in my judgment, we need to set aside whether or not greenhouse gases have been caused by mankind or because of natural effects and the focus on the technologies that will enable us to live better lives at the same time protect the environment." Unquote.
George Bush doesn't care about
Man Bear Pig.
As it stands, An Inconvenient Truth was all over the place during 2006. If you were alive at the time, you probably remember it in some capacity, even if it was just through South Park or the news. You likely heard of the film, even if you didn't see it. Even my mom bought it from Blockbuster, and my mom's favorite movies consist of Twilight and the Minions. I'm telling you, it was everywhere.
We are living our lives above with so much information.
Did you hear the news? Apple is coming out with an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. An iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator in one device.
These are not 3 separate devices. This is one device.
Paris Hilton was released from prison, and Lindsay Lohan was then put into one. Miley Cyrus was in the midst of her Best of Both Worlds tour, and Britney was undergoing a public mental struggle that prompted one of the most iconic YouTube videos of 2007. With the internet's rising popularity, it seemed it was on a collision course with the film industry. While YouTube offered people the chance to upload their own content to the site, it wasn't designed for distributors to license their films to the site. Netflix recognized where the film industry was going and capitalized on it by becoming the first streaming site, or at least the first one that mattered. Its popularity throughout the years has been indicative of a trend that has been ongoing since the release of the VHS. When the VHS came out in '76, it was a novelty to the public. The idea of watching a movie at your house was revolutionary. As cool as it was to see a movie in the comfort of your own home, the public still mostly preferred going to the theater. Theaters were more immediate. If you wanted to wait to see a movie at home, have fun waiting 4 to 6 months. And when you watched the movie at home, the screen was much smaller and not as high quality. The theater was ultimately the place to see a new movie. Still though, the fact that it was now an option meant that some people would happily wait those 4 to 6 months. Once we went from VHS to DVD, picture quality was getting better and TVs were getting bigger. And slowly but surely, the appeal of watching a movie at home was increasing. And by the time 2007 rolled around, the technology in one's home was beginning to be able to provide a compelling alternative to going to the theater. Why go to a movie theater with annoying people on their phones when you could enjoy a movie in the comfort of your own home? People were beginning to slowly prefer staying at home to watch a movie, and because of this, theater attendance has gone down. This is a trend that is continuing to this day, especially in a post-COVID world. Because audiences were now less interested in going out to see a movie, marketing teams scrambled to find ways to get people to come back to the theater. Something that would generate a lot of activity. Not just any kind of normal activity. I'm talking about some paranormal activity. Paranormal Activity was made by Oren Peli, a video game designer with no formal film training. He shot the entire movie in a week in 2006 for $15,000. As it turns out, there was barely even a script, but rather just the bare story beats. The actors improvised a lot of the material and did whatever felt right in the moment.
Simply because it was like, we're not going to provide a script. There is no script. You're going to have to shoot like all hours of the night without sleeping, and not even knowing what's going to happen to you next.
Once the film was completed, it did its rounds in a couple of film festivals. The film was given enough praise at this point that Paramount stepped in to distribute the film. Much like Netflix, they too also recognized the power of the internet. They said, hey, if the internet could be used as a tool to get people away from the theater, then maybe it could be used as a tool to bring them back. On a website called Eventful, they gave people the power to determine where the next screening of the film would be. This, alongside a genius trailer that spliced together footage from the film with audiences reacting to it, helped generate buzz for the movie, and people voted in drones to get this movie to screen at a movie theater near them. The film ended up generating $200 million after being made by nothing. As the film industry stood, there was a new kind of tug of war going on between the theater and the streamer. Both of them were in a custody battle for the audience. They are both trying their best to find ways to keep people coming back to them. A battle that today is pretty much over. Streaming platforms have left theaters in the dust at this point. Movie theaters are expensive. You have very few good options for food, and people can be on their phones and just be annoying. What a year in film. What a year. Genuinely, 2008 is fucking incredible. Like, filled to the brim with bangers. Tropic Thunder, Pineapple Express, The Strangers, Benjamin Button, Mamma Mia, The Dark Knight, and the star of this segment, Iron Man. I know there was a lot of great films in this year, and trust me, I would have loved to talk some of the other ones instead, but Iron Man is indicative of where the film industry was going and set the tone for the Marvel Universe. While I can see some questioning choosing Iron Man over The Dark Knight, again, I think it boils down to influence. This might sound like an odd reason for not including The Dark Knight, but the movie is too damn good. It's number 3 on top rated movies of all time on IMDb, and this thing is just stellar. While The Dark Knight is no doubt a phenomenal movie, I have one question for you, and really think about it. Thinking of the film industry today, and all of the films that have come out, which of these two films do you think they use as a blueprint? Iron Man. So while I would have loved to give more time to discuss The Dark Knight, I think Iron Man is much more representative of where the superhero genre would go, and thus more definitive. Like some of the other movies on this list, Iron Man got caught in development hell. This movie was originally supposed to be released after Universal Studios bought the film rights to Iron Man. Nothing happened with Universal, so in '96, 20th Century Fox bought the rights to Iron Man, and then Nicolas Cage actually came in and was like, hey, I'll be Iron Man. After that fell through, Tom Cruise also approached Fox with interest in being Iron Man. This time, the film was actually getting somewhere. Stan Lee himself even stepped in to write a story for Fox where MODOK was intended to be the villain. Fox then wanted Quentin Tarantino to direct the film, which he likely said no to doing. For the next 5 years, the script for Iron Man went through rewrite after rewrite, but nothing really ever came for it. The prospect of doing an Iron Man film was dead in the water by 2005. It was also in 2005 that the rights to Iron Man went all the way back to Marvel, and they once again tried to get the project going from scratch. Marvel approached over 30 different writers, all of whom said no, given how unknown Iron Man was. To counteract Iron Man's obscurity, Marvel conducted a series of focus groups to change the popular misconception that Iron Man was a robot. And after all of that, finally, Jon Favreau was hired to direct the film, and although it led to numerous fights with Marvel, he cast Robert Downey Jr. for the part. Marvel pushed back against Downey for his history with drugs and alcohol, to which Favreau pointed out that is Iron Man. In his words, quote, "The best and worst moments of Robert's life have been in the public eye. He had to find an inner balance to overcome obstacles that went far beyond his career. That's Tony Stark," unquote. Despite casting RDJ and numerous other things working against the film, this thing was a massive hit. At the time, it had one of the best opening weekends for a non-sequel. And for those of you familiar with Marvel movies, I'm sure most of you can see why this film is significant. It was the first film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. To the producers at Marvel, the success of this movie was enough to give them the green light to the rest of the films. If a character like Iron Man, being portrayed by Robert Downey, could do this much, imagine what else they could do with the countless number of superhero characters home to Marvel. While it isn't directly stated by any executives or producers, I'm skeptical of how far the MCU would have gone if Iron Man and, say, 2 other films flopped. The success of Iron Man validated their efforts in creating one of the most ambitious string of films that would come out the following years. Iron Man signifies both where the industry went and where it could have gone instead. I'm sure you're all aware of how popular superhero films have been since the release of these 2 movies. When Iron Man came out, the studios felt a lot of pressure to make a good movie, since they weren't riding the trend of superhero movies yet. There was no trend. Once the genre caught momentum, producers became complacent, and audiences slowly began to lower their expectations. Compare the first Iron Man to the most recent Thor movie, and one has to ask themselves, what happened? Marvel and DC fans have been sucked into this feedback loop. We're going to see the latest installment is Ritual. There's no effort required, as no matter how shaky things get, they'll always return. If it makes money, Hollywood's gonna do it 100 times over.
And I also hear people say all the time, why do y'all keep doing these movies? That's the dumbest fucking question in the world. I'm gonna tell you why. Because if you spend $200 million and you make $1 billion, who the fuck is you gonna tell to stop shooting movies when you making $800 motherfucking million?
If you know anything about film, this year is the most obvious, or maybe it was 2008, but let's just cut to the chase. It's Avatar. I know. I think many people might be quick to roll their eyes or click off the video here. I get it, but it's undeniable. This film is revolutionary for a ton of reasons. As we've been discussing, films in the 2000s were gradually becoming less and less practical, and James Cameron jumped in the mix and was like, hey, what if the entire movie was CG? The vision for this film was so huge that James Cameron had to put off making this film for over 10 years. Development for Avatar began all the way back in 1994, and the film was originally supposed to begin shooting sometime around 1997. Because the CG at the time wasn't good enough, Cameron put off the project until he felt the technology could completely capture the world of Avatar. The film finally began shooting in 2007 and utilized this new technology called match moving, or the more commonly used term, motion capture. I don't want to bore you with the details of how motion capture works, but what the technology does is basically sample the movements of the actors many times per second. These movements are then recorded and transposed onto a model. In this way, the model becomes animated to reflect the emotions of the actors and keep their performances alive. Of course, in the mid-2000s, this technology still had ways to go, but the rate of improvement was exponential. Technology was coming along quicker and quicker, which now made films like Avatar possible. In order to make the most out of this technology, what better way to showcase it than by making an epic science fiction film? The story in Avatar revolves around humans trying to infiltrate the planet Pandora for resources, which is home to the Na'vi. The humans' means for exploring this planet is by using a avatar, effectively a human mind in a Na'vi body. From there, tensions rise as our main character ultimately turns his back on the humans once he understands the Na'vi way of life. The film covers a variety of themes ranging from imperialism to deep ecology. Though the film has been praised for its originality, some people argue the film blatantly steals from films like Atlantis, Princess Mononoke, Pocahontas, and Devil with Wolves. While these films are all similar to Avatar, no doubt, to say that Avatar rips off these movies is disingenuous. I mean that's like saying Cocaine Bear is a ripoff of Jaws. These films have similarities, sure, but it's not the point where you can argue that Cocaine Bear is some kind of copy-paste job. And if Avatar is such a ripoff, wouldn't these films I just listed off be ripoffs of each other? No. The elephant in the room, though, is that many people would like to argue that the story of Avatar isn't that impressive and the film only managed to succeed because of its groundbreaking technology. Truth be told, I somewhat agree. I mean, while I do enjoy the story of Avatar, I feel if the film looked like this, no one would care. Historically, films that have pushed technology ahead have succeeded because it was a novelty. When Star Wars came out, people hadn't seen anything like it, hence, it became such a big part of pop culture. Like Avatar, Star Wars also pushed technology forward at the time with the sci-fi story. While it is true that these films were helped by their use of revolutionary technology, this argument is flawed. If you watch Star Wars today, it looks like complete shit by today's standards, yeah. But to a person in the 70s, this was no doubt the pinnacle of technology. But a person living in the 21st century isn't going to be impressed by this. So why is Star Wars still so popular to this day? Because of the story. I think the same will happen for Avatar. People in the future might think the movie looks like crap, but it won't matter. I feel people will still love to go back to the movie just like they do Star Wars. I think Avatar is the perfect way for the decade to have ended. It solidified the future Hollywood was going in. A future that would consist of green screens and movies Martin Scorsese doesn't think are cinema. While James Cameron used this technology to tell an original story with a clear artistic vision in mind, it wouldn't be long before this technology would be used more of a crux than as an artistic decision. Avatar raised the bar for CG and led to the future of film being one where audiences not only expected films to meet a certain standard, but adamantly demanded it. All in all, the decade ended in a climax of technology that would set up the next decade of film. The 2000s were a strange decade in film. It was going through its technological adolescence. By the 2010s, the film industry had reached its technological adulthood. The most influential films in this decade were ones that set a trend, commented on cultural issues, or kept up with the progression of the ever-increasing speed of technological development. Every single genre, from animation to science fiction to superhero movies, were able to break new ground because of the tools now available to filmmakers. All of these changes led to the next decade of film, the 2010s, a decade that I might cover in the future, but truth be told, I'm not exactly eager to talk about Avengers and Marvel for 40 minutes, so I'm leaning towards covering the 80s or 90s next, should I do another one of these. I chose the 2000s truthfully out of bias. This was the decade I grew up in, and many of these films have a soft spot for me. Some of my earliest memories are Shrek and Spider-Man, so I felt inclined to speak about movies close to heart. Though the 2000s wasn't a perfect decade for film, I feel it was the perfect decade for me to grow up with.